So Professor Weindling, can you tell us a bit about the exhibition and why it's important?
Well, from the general context of Holocaust history, the Nazis exploited bodies in working prisoners in concentration camps to death. They exploited the hair and the bones of those who were subjected to killings by poison gas. But they also took the opportunity of advancing medical research by using the bodies, the tissue, the skin, the soft tissue, the internal organs, and the bones of prisoners in order to advance German medical research.
And how many victims of coerced experimentation were there, would you say?
Okay. Well, we've tried to identify each individual person for all the different sets of experiments, so that to date we are very confident that we have, in terms of overall numbers of victims, that we can link with and prove the number is 15,754 victims. Then we have a further 12,008 individuals who claimed compensation for some form of brutality in a concentration camp, or that they were subjected to surgical operations, for example. And there, it's still grey whether they are the victim of an experiment or whether they were subjected to some other form of injury and brutality in their experiences. Overall, we know that 20% of the victims were Jewish. That would be 3,568 definitely documented Jewish victims, and of these 1,934 were definitely in Auschwitz. I've given very exact numbers because that represents the individuals that we have counted up, experiment by experiment, and sort of reconstructing this. But in truth, as we find more experiments which were conducted, numbers will rise slightly. On the other hand, we sometimes are able, because people will have changed their name on a number of occasions, so we can sometimes see, by linking the different names, that's one person. So that that means that numbers slightly go down. So these aren't absolute numbers, but I think they show that the scale of the experiments was really very, very large. It was quite substantial. If we add in persons who were, for example, used for anthropological research, photographed, or subjected to large nutrition experiments in a concentration camp like Mauthausen, we actually come to 90,000 victims approximately. So that's a really large number. And I think it's important in Holocaust history to reconstruct groups as a whole. And then we can, that gives one a framework for then seeing, well, how many survived, how many were killed, and then looking at the experiments in terms of the intensification of research that went on in Nazi Germany. So what we get is a low but constant level of research on victims from the time the Nazis took power, but the numbers really rise in 1942, and we still have new experiments in 1945. So the German scientists knew the war was lost, but here was a great opportunity for unregulated research that they were taking.
And why do you think it's taken so long for this history to be uncovered or to be fully fleshed out?
Yes, I mean, the fact that the Nazis conducted experiments on victims is one of the best known aspects of Holocaust history. And a perpetrator like Josef Mengele is really well known. He's perhaps the best known of all the many perpetrators that there were in Holocaust history on the one hand. On the other hand, reconstructing in detail what he was doing in Auschwitz when he came from May 44, the different types of research that he was conducting, first of all on Sinti and Roma, or use the colloquial term gypsies, when he was a doctor of the gypsy family camp, and looking at, for example, there was a nutritional illness resulting in the actual eating of the jawbone away. From that beginning research, then a small number of gypsy twins who were in fact killed when the gypsy camp was liquidated at the beginning of July 44, and then switching over to Jewish victims as the Hungarians streamed into Auschwitz, and he could stand on the ramp and select twins and dwarves and use what he was primarily doing was selection for the gas chambers, but he was using this as a research opportunity, and he was hoping to advance his career and keeping in constant touch with the research institute of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology in Berlin. And it's plausible to suppose that what he actually wanted to do was to get a higher doctorate to advance his career as well. So that reconstructing this in great detail, and then reconstructing the twins. How many twins were there, for example? That's something which is not that well known.
And would you say that there's any results from the experiments that have been, or from Nazi medical science that has found its way or continues to be used today? Is that?
Well, that's the sort of the question which is constantly in people's minds, which I'm very pleased to answer. I think the first thing that needs to be said about this experiments and other forms of coerced medical research that was conducted, it's not pseudoscience. This is science in conjunction with major research institutes or the funders of research, and that many of the involved scientists had academic positions or had academic links. So Mengele is a very good example. He had 2 doctorates, one in anthropology, an MD on cleft palate, and one can see some of his research is actually building on his earlier doctoral research, and the fact that he is sending specimens, for example, eyes of different colors, which he found in a Sinti family called Mekau. They're different colored eyes, and then should be also eyes of Jewish twins as well that he found. So this gruesome killing to order that went on shows the effort to to supply large quantities of body parts, and we know that body parts were then used in German scientific institutes long term after the war, so they were building up like body banks. Now, what sort of research? This is scientific research, not necessarily good science, not necessarily necessary science. The sort of research which has retained some form of validity, I can give 2 examples. One which was from the freezing water experiments in Dachau. The observation was made that if the neck was kept out of the water of the person, then that assisted survival, so that assisted the design of life jackets. It wasn't necessarily the correct way of proving it. Nonetheless, there seems to be some interest in these results. Another type of research was done on poison gases, so that there was a group who were subjected to gassing at the concentration camp in Alsace of Natzweiler-Struthof, and there the amount of gas used to kill, of phosgene in this particular case, shows was the basis for the setting of a safe level of exposure to the gas, and that measure has remained in the literature on the toxicity. But in truth, for all the resources poured into these experiments, so-called, the amount of usable results is very, very little. And if we compare it to the research work of the British and the American, or the Allied research effort during the war, where safer levels were used and a lot of self-experimentation by scientists, that was a lot more successful than what the Germans were able to manage.